Gate 22 to New York. Final boarding. That was supposed to be the last thing I ever heard in this country. I never thought the day I finally left Simon Ford would be the same day I watched a man reach into his jacket and realize he was willing to die for a woman he'd never met. I had one bag, one ticket, and for the first time in 6 years, I had one thought that didn't belong to Simon. I'm going to make it. Rome's Fiumicino airport was chaos. Rolling luggage, boarding calls bleeding into each other in 3 languages, the sharp smell of espresso cutting through the recycled air. I kept my head down. That's what you learn after 6 years with a man like Simon Ford. You learn how to make yourself small, how to move through a room without being seen, how to breathe without taking up too much space. And I was 40 feet from the gate when I heard his footsteps. I didn't have to turn around. I knew those footsteps the way you know a sound that has hurt you before, the particular rhythm of someone who has never once in their life been told no. Brenda. My name in his mouth was never a greeting. It was always a leash. He was flanked by 2 men in suits, his lawyers, his shadows, his instruments. He wasn't supposed to be in Italy. The order was filed in 3 jurisdictions. But Simon Ford had spent 20 years learning that paper cannot stop a man with enough money and enough contempt. I tried to walk. He caught my arm first. The terminal kept moving around us. Families, tourists, a child crying somewhere near the pretzel kiosk. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever does. "You don't leave," he said quietly, the way he always said the things that were meant to leave marks. "You don't get to just leave." And then he raised his hand. I closed my eyes. I heard the slap before I felt it. But when I opened my eyes, Simon wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the man in the dark jacket behind me, the man who hadn't flinched, the man whose right hand had moved, slowly, deliberately, toward his inner pocket. And the entire terminal went very, very still. It happened in 3 seconds. I know because I counted them afterward, lying on the cold marble floor of the terminal, with a stranger's hand pressed gently against my shoulder, asking me in rapid Italian if I could stand. 3 seconds between the sound of the slap and the sound of boots, a dozen of them, thundering across the polished travertine like the opening of something that couldn't be closed again. The man in the dark jacket, I would learn his name was Richard Bradford, had not fired. He hadn't even cleared the holster. But the intention had been enough. In an airport, intention is a crime all on its own. 4 members of the Polizia di Frontiera hit him from 3 angles simultaneously, the kind of coordinated movement that suggested they had been watching him long before Simon raised his hand to my face. Richard went down without resistance, and that was the part that stayed with me longer than anything else that afternoon. He didn't fight them. He let them take him, his jaw set, his dark eyes finding mine across the chaos of the terminal floor, as though he were trying to tell me something I wasn't yet equipped to understand. Simon, meanwhile, was performing. He was already straightening his Brioni lapels, already reaching for the phone in the breast pocket of his suit, the one I recognized as the limited edition Virtu, titanium-cased, the kind of device that existed purely to signal that its owner operated in a world where normal rules applied to other people. His lawyers materialized from somewhere in the crowd, like they'd been waiting in the wings for exactly this scene. One of them already had a business card between his fingers. Another was speaking into a headset in clipped, transactional English. They put chrome cuffs on both men. I want you to understand what it felt like to watch that. To watch the man who had spent 6 years teaching me the geography of fear being restrained in the same breath as the man who had tried, for reasons I could not yet name, to stop him. The symmetry of it was almost unbearable. Simon caught my eye as they walked him toward a side corridor, and he smiled. Not the sharp, dangerous smile from before. This one was slower, patient. The smile of a man who has been temporarily inconvenienced and knows exactly how to fix it. Richard Bradford did not smile. He looked at the floor as they led him away, and I noticed, absurdly in the middle of everything, that his watch was a Patek Philippe. A Nautilus, rose gold, the kind that doesn't announce itself unless you already know what you're looking at. It caught the terminal light as they folded his hands behind his back, and I remember thinking that it was a strange thing to notice, that I was cataloging the accessories of the man who had almost killed my ex-husband, standing in a Roman airport with a swelling cheekbone and a boarding pass I was never going to use. An officer guided me to a row of seats near the gate, the real leather kind, part of the premium lounge spillover, and someone brought me water in a glass bottle with a silver cap. I sat there for a long time. The terminal reassembled itself around me. The announcements resumed. A child somewhere was laughing at something on a tablet. A woman in a camel-colored coat walked past, pulling a Rimowa carry-on that caught the light like brushed steel. Life, utterly indifferent, continued. A female officer with kind eyes and a careful English accent sat across from me and asked if I wanted to press charges against my husband. I told her he was my ex-husband. She wrote something down. She told me that the other man, the one with the firearm, was being processed on multiple charges, including illegal weapons possession and criminal threatening. She said his name carefully, like she was reading it for the first time, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't. Richard Bradford. She asked if I knew him. I told her I had never seen him before in my life. She looked at me for a moment longer than the question required, then wrote something else down and told me I was free to rebook my flight. I thanked her. I did not move. I sat in that leather seat with the unopened water bottle between my palms, and I stared at the corridor they had walked Richard Bradford down, and I thought about the way he had looked at me before they took him. Not like a man who had done something impulsive, like a man who had made a decision he'd been carrying for a long time and had finally found the right place to set it down. Simon would be out by nightfall. I already knew that the way you know weather, not from data, but from years of learning how a particular sky behaves. The question I couldn't answer yet was what would happen to the man who had tried to change it. They gave me a hotel voucher. That was the part that almost made me laugh. The Polizia di Frontiera, as of processing me through their system with the careful efficiency of people who handle disrupted travelers daily, producing a printed voucher for 2 nights at the Palazzo delle Stelle, a 4-star property 12 minutes from the terminal by their own shuttle. I took it with both hands like it was something fragile, like the small normalcy of it might shatter if I held it wrong. The room was on the 7th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a courtyard strung with amber lights, a king bed dressed in 800 thread count linen the color of fresh cream, a marble bathroom with a freestanding tub and a collection of Acqua di Parma toiletries arranged on the ledge like small amber monuments. Under any other circumstances, I would have stood at that window for an hour, letting the city teach me how to exhale. And instead, I sat on the edge of the bed in my coat, still holding my boarding pass, and I watched the door. I don't know when I started doing that, watching doors, positioning myself in rooms so that I could always see the entry point. Simon had given me that. 6 years of recalibrating my nervous system until threat assessment became as automatic as breathing. My phone buzzed at 6:47 in the evening. Not a call, a message. No name attached to the number. But I knew the area code the way you know the sound of something that has broken you before. It was a Washington number. One of the ones he rotated through when he wanted distance between himself and whatever he was about to say. 2 hours, Brenda. That's all it took. Now you have no one. Asterisk. I set the phone face down on the duvet and sat very still. 2 hours. I'd been in this room for less than 3, which meant he hadn't waited for the shock to settle before reminding me of the arithmetic. That was pure Simon Ford. Not the violence itself, but the immediate accounting afterward. The ledger. He needed me to understand, before I had time to catch my breath, that the balance had already shifted back in his favor. I thought about Richard Bradford in a holding cell somewhere in this city. His Patek Philippe confiscated and bagged in a property envelope. His hands that had moved toward a weapon on behalf of a woman whose name he hadn't even known, folded in his lap or pressed flat on a metal table. I thought about whether he had anyone sending him messages, or whether anyone was doing for him what Simon's team of lawyers had done for Simon within the space of a single Roman afternoon, working phones, calling in debts, translating money into motion. Simon had 3 attorneys in Italy alone. I had learned that the hard way during the divorce proceedings, watching his legal infrastructure operate like a Formula One pit crew, precise, expensive, terrifyingly fast. He knew people in Brussels, in Geneva, in rooms where decisions got made before anyone wrote them down. A firearms charge against a foreign national with a sealed record was not a complication for a man like that. It was an afternoon's work for one junior associate. Richard Bradford, from what I understood, was not a man without resources, but he was currently inside an Italian federal system, facing charges that carried the kind of weight that doesn't dissolve overnight, regardless of who you knew. The officer with the kind eyes had said the words attempted execution without flinching. That was not something a competent lawyer smoothed over before dinner. I got up and went to the window. The courtyard below was quiet now. The amber lights reflected in the wet stone from an earlier rain I hadn't noticed. A couple sat at the small outdoor bar, she in a belted Burberry trench, he in a cashmere turtleneck so dark it was nearly black, leaning toward each other over 2 glasses of Barolo, unhurried, unafraid. The ordinary beauty of a life lived without a locked door in your chest. My phone buzzed again. Same number. No words this time, just a photograph. It was taken from outside. Through my window, which meant from a rooftop or a long lens positioned somewhere in the dark above the courtyard. The image was sharp enough to be professional. It showed me sitting on the edge of the bed in my coat, holding my boarding pass, watching the door. He wanted me to know he could see me before I could see him. He wanted me to feel the distance between us collapse into something airless and close. I pulled the curtains. Then I sat back down on that cream-colored linen, and I did something I hadn't done since the afternoon. A terminal full of strangers had watched Simon Ford remind me who he believed I belonged to. I thought clearly. Not about escape. Not about the next flight, or the next city, or the next version of a life assembled carefully out of reach. I thought about a man in a dark jacket who had made a decision that cost him everything for a stranger, and I thought about the specific, unfamiliar weight of owing someone a debt you didn't ask for, but couldn't pretend wasn't real. Simon was right about one thing. I had no one. But Richard Bradford, at this moment, had even less. I found the chapel by accident. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was that I had been walking for 2 hours through the streets surrounding the hotel, not with any destination, but with the particular restlessness of someone whose body refuses to stay still while her mind is working through something too large to sit with. I had left the Palazzo della Stella through the service entrance, instinctively, on the way you learn to exit buildings when you've spent years ensuring your movements aren't observed. The early morning air carried the smell of rain-wet cobblestone and espresso from a bar already open on the corner, its copper counter gleaming under a single hanging light. The chapel was tucked between a pharmacy and a shuttered leather goods shop on a narrow street that the tourist maps had apparently agreed to ignore. No signage, just a carved stone arch and a door left open by 3 inches, amber light pressing through the gap like a quiet invitation. I went in because it was the kind of place Simon would never think to look. The interior was small and very old, Frescoed ceiling darkened by centuries of candle smoke. A dozen votive lights arranged on an iron stand near the entrance. And wooden pews worn smooth by the accumulated weight of everyone who had ever needed somewhere to sit, with something unbearable. I chose a pew near the back, set my bag beside me, and stared at the altar without praying. I wasn't sure I still knew how. I didn't hear him approach. He was simply there, seated one pew ahead and to my left, turned slightly in my direction, as though he had been waiting long enough to have grown comfortable with the wait. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, in a way that his charcoal Xenia overcoat did its best to civilize. Silver at his temples, a face that had been handsome once and had traded that for something more durable. A Bulgari signet ring on his right hand caught the votive light when he folded his hands on the pew back. He looked like someone who attended chapels, not for comfort, but because he respected old things. He spoke first, in English, that carried the particular precision of someone who had learned it as a tool rather than a birthright. "You are safer here than at the hotel. He has someone watching the lobby." I didn't ask how he knew which hotel. I didn't ask how he knew my face. I understood, in the way that certain moments simply clarify themselves, that this man had known exactly where I was before I'd decided to leave. "Who are you?" I asked. He gave me a name, Donatello Ricci, and then immediately indicated, with a small movement of his hand, that the name was the least important thing about him. What mattered, he said quietly, was that he had been with Richard Bradford for 19 years, that he managed certain interests on Richard's behalf, and that, as of 3 hours ago, those interests had become significantly more complicated. He told me about the transfer in the same tone someone might use to discuss a change in weather. Unhurried. Precise. Richard was being moved from the federal holding facility to Rebibia, Rome's oldest and most impenetrable correctional institution, a place where the walls were thick enough to absorb sound, and the guards had learned, over generations, that some arrangements were more durable than the law itself. The transfer had been expedited. The paperwork had moved through the system at a speed that paperwork in Italian federal institutions almost never achieves on its own. Simon had spent the money. Of course he had. Not enough to get Richard out. That would attract the wrong kind of attention. But enough to ensure that once Richard was inside Rebibia, and certain protections would cease to function. Certain eyes would find other things to look at. Ricci slid a manila envelope onto the pew beside me. Inside was a single photograph, an aerial image of a transit route, and a timeline printed in clean 12-point type. The paper was heavy stock, the kind used for legal correspondence. Even urgency, in Richard Bradford's world, apparently observed certain standards. He explained what the timeline meant. Richard's transport was scheduled for the following morning. Once he was inside Rebibia, the window closed. Not temporarily. Permanently. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "I'm no one in this. I'm the woman he stood next to for 30 seconds. Ricci looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded note. Actual paper, on handwritten in ink the color of midnight, the penmanship of someone who had been educated in an era when handwriting was considered a form of character. I opened it. 3 sentences. No signature. You did not ask to be protected. I did not ask for a reason. But if you are reading this, I may need you to be braver than either of us expected. I folded it along its original crease and held it in both hands. Outside, somewhere past the carved stone arch and the narrow street and the sleeping city, morning was beginning its slow negotiation with the dark. I put the note in my coat pocket, next to my heart, and I asked Ricci where we needed to start. Ricci drove a gunmetal Maserati Quattroporte that moved through the pre-dawn streets of Rome like a rumor, quiet, purposeful, leaving no trace of itself in the air. The leather interior smelled of cedar and old money, the dashboard lit in soft amber that made the darkness outside feel managed rather than threatening. He did not turn on music. He did not make small talk. He simply drove, and I sat in the passenger seat with the folded note still in my coat pocket, watching the city rearrange itself around us as we moved away from the tourist corridors and into neighborhoods that didn't appear in any itinerary I had ever read. He took me to a private room above a restaurant that was closed at this hour, accessible through a courtyard door that required a specific knock and a face the man inside already knew. The room itself was modest by design rather than necessity. Bare plaster walls, to a single painting of the Roman countryside in a gilded frame that cost more than everything else in the space combined, a round table with 2 chairs and a bottle of Sassicaia already open and breathing. Ricci poured without asking. I wrapped both hands around the glass and let the warmth of it settle into my palms. Then he told me about Adriana. She was Richard's younger sister, 14 months between them, close enough in age that they had grown up less like siblings and more like a unit. 2 people who had learned early that the world outside their home in Palermo was arranged against people like them, and had decided, wordlessly, to face it together. Richard had been 23 when he first began building what would eventually become his empire. Adriana had been 22, finishing a degree in art restoration in Florence, and living in a 4th-floor apartment with tall shuttered windows and a view of the Arno that she described in her letters as the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. Her husband, a man named Cesare, from a family with political architecture in 3 southern regions, had begun hurting her in the 2nd year of their marriage. Quietly at first, in the specific, methodical way that certain men treat cruelty as a discipline rather than an impulse. By the 3rd year, the letters Adriana sent Richard had changed in register, the handwriting more careful, the details more curated, the silences between sentences wider than the sentences themselves. Richard had read every one of them and understood every one of them, and had done nothing. Not out of indifference. Ricci was precise about this point, on setting down his glass and looking at me directly so I would not misread what he was about to say. Richard had done nothing because Adriana had asked him not to, because she had believed, with the specific, devastating faith of someone who has invested too much to reconsider, that things would correct themselves, that Cesare would change, that love, applied with enough patience, was capable of renovation. She had asked her brother to stay back, and Richard Bradford, who had by then made a career of ignoring every boundary placed in front of him, had honored the one that cost him the most. She died on a Tuesday in October. The official record called it an accident. Richard had received the call in the middle of a meeting at his office overlooking the Tiber, the windows dressed in hand-stitched Rubelli drapery, the room smelling of leather and espresso, and the specific confidence of a man who had convinced himself that control was something you could architect if you were disciplined enough. He had walked out of that meeting, descended to the street, and stood in the November rain for a long time without moving. Ricci said he had been the one to find him there. He never forgave himself for the waiting, Ricci said. Not for what Cesare did, for the waiting, for deciding that her comfort in asking mattered more than what he could see with his own eyes. I stared at the Sassicaia in my glass. Cesare? I asked. Ricci touched the signet ring on his right hand once briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it is still there. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. What Richard Bradford had become after Adriana, the precision, for the reputation, the particular quality of stillness he carried into dangerous rooms, had been built on a single, unbreakable promise made to a woman who could no longer hear it. He had decided that he would never again stand at a careful distance from someone else's violence and call it respect. I thought about a terminal full of indifferent strangers, a man whose right hand had moved, slowly, deliberately, toward his inner pocket. 30 seconds. That was all he had known me. But he hadn't been seeing me. He had been seeing Florence, a fourth-floor apartment, tall, shuttered windows, and a letter he had read too carefully and acted on too late. The Sassicaia was still half full when Ricci unfolded the map. It was not a digital map. No screens, no devices, nothing that could be intercepted or traced. It was hand-drawn on architectural paper, the kind used for building schematics, rendered in a draftsman's precise ink lines, with intersections labeled in a shorthand I couldn't immediately read. He smoothed it flat on the table between us with both palms, and then stepped back, as though giving me room to think rather than prompting me toward a conclusion he had already reached. 3 other men were in the room by then. They had arrived separately, at intervals, each admitted through the courtyard door with the same quiet knock. None of them introduced themselves by name. One wore a camel overcoat, with a Loro Piana label visible at the collar when he sat down. Another had the particular posture of someone with military history. Straight-spined, hands visible, economy of movement. The third was young, perhaps mid-20s, and said nothing at all, but watched everything with the focused attention of someone who understood that silence, applied correctly, is its own form of intelligence. Ricci explained the route. Richard's transport was scheduled to depart the federal holding facility at 6:15 the following morning. The van would take one of 3 possible routes toward Rabibia, standard protocol for high-value transfers, designed to prevent exactly the kind of conversation currently happening in this room. The problem, Ricci said, setting a single finger on the map, was the decision point. Whichever route the transport coordinator chose would be confirmed internally no more than 40 minutes before departure. That window was the only window. Once the van was moving, the variables multiplied beyond management. We need the route confirmed before they move him, Ricci said, which means we need the decision before the coordinator makes it. I was still looking at the map when I understood why I was in this room. Not for comfort. Not because Ricci was a man inclined toward sentiment. I was here because I had something none of the men around this table possessed. 6 years of living inside Simon Ford's operational logic. His schedules, his security preferences, his network of contacts who existed specifically to move information through systems that were supposed to be sealed. I had watched him do it from the inside, had been present for enough phone calls and enough quiet arrangements to understand not just what he was capable of, but how he thought. The architecture of his influence. I pulled the map closer, and Simon's private aviation account was managed through a company registered in Luxembourg. I had signed the household documents during the marriage, had seen the account references enough times to have absorbed them the way you absorb anything you encounter repeatedly. His Italian security contractor was a firm called Meridian Executive Protection, whose regional coordinator I had met twice at functions in Washington. A precise, watchful man named Stefano, who wore Montblanc cufflinks and had the handshake of someone who wanted you to know exactly how much pressure he was capable of applying. Stefano reported directly to Simon's chief of staff. And Simon's chief of staff I knew with the certainty of someone who had overheard too many conversations not meant for her ears. Ma had a standing arrangement with a senior administrator inside the federal transfer system. Not a corrupt arrangement, precisely. More an understanding, the kind built on shared history and mutual inconvenience avoidance. That administrator would know the route before the transport coordinator confirmed it. And that administrator had a particular weakness that Simon had exploited before. A financial exposure in the Cayman Islands that Simon held like a card he never needed to play because the threat of it was sufficient. But it cut both ways. If that exposure became known through a different channel before Simon could deploy it as leverage, the administrator's motivation shifted entirely. He would have reason to cooperate with someone who could contain the damage rather than someone who manufactured it. I explained all of this carefully, using the map and the shorthand notes Ricci passed me to mark the relevant connection points. The man in the Loro Piana overcoat listened without expression. The military-postured one made 2 notes on a small leather-bound pad. The young one had not moved. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Ricci looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Not surprise, but a recalibration. The slight adjustment of a man who has estimated a thing and found his estimate was short. "You spent 6 years with that man," he said finally. "Yes," I said. "And he never understood what he had in the room with him." It wasn't a question. I didn't treat it as one. I picked up the pen Ricci had left on the table. A Montegrappa, heavyweight, unbalanced, like something designed to sign documents that alter the course of things, and I drew a clean line between 2 points on the map. "Here," I said, "this is where we need to be." The rain began at 4 in the morning. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind that announces itself with thunder and spectacle, but the quiet, persistent kind that settles into the streets of Rome like a decision already made, darkening the cobblestones to the color of slate, collecting in the grooves of ancient stone, turning every street lamp into a smeared amber impression of itself. I stood at the window of the safe house Ricci had arranged, a 3rd-floor apartment in Prati, furnished with the spare, deliberate taste of a place maintained for function rather than comfort, though someone had seen fit to stock the kitchen with lavazza and leave a cashmere throw folded on the arm of the single chair. And I watched the rain, and I rehearsed the timing in my mind until it stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like memory. The car they gave me was a graphite Alfa Romeo Giulia, unremarkable enough for Rome's pre-dawn streets, capable enough to do what needed doing. The registration was clean, the plates were current. In the glove compartment, beneath a road map of Lazio I would not need, was a burner phone with 2 numbers already stored and a single instruction from Ricci delivered in person at 3:45. The moment you see the lights, you move. Not before, not after. Asterisk, I had asked him, in the safe house kitchen over coffee I was too tightly wound to taste, whether he trusted me to do this correctly. He had looked at me for a moment with that recalibrating expression I was beginning to recognize. "Richard trusted you before he knew your name," he said. "That is a higher bar than mine." I left the apartment at 5:40 and drove the route twice in the rain, learning the particular behavior of each intersection, which traffic signals ran on timers, which ones were sensor-dependent, where the road narrowed enough that a vehicle positioned at the correct angle would compress the available space to a single, inescapable point. The street I needed was a secondary corridor, running parallel to the Lungotevere, old enough that the curbs were uneven, lined on one side by a continuous stone wall that belonged to a private garden and offered nothing in the way of alternative passage. Wide enough for a transport van proceeding at standard speed, not wide enough for one that needed to maneuver around an obstacle it hadn't anticipated. At 6:11, the burner phone vibrated once, a single character, the number 1, which meant the route coordinator had chosen the secondary corridor, as the man with the Cayman Islands exposure had quietly ensured he would, and that Richard's transport was 4 minutes behind schedule due to a processing delay that Ricci's people had introduced into the departure paperwork with the delicate precision of surgeons. 4 minutes was a gift I had not counted on. I positioned the Giulia diagonally across the narrowing point at 6:17, killing the engine, but leaving the hazard lights blinking, the international shorthand for mechanical misfortune, innocent and mundane. So then I stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, because an umbrella would suggest preparedness, and preparedness would suggest something other than a woman whose car had failed her at the worst possible moment. I wore the coat I'd had since the airport, practical, unremarkable, nothing that would be remembered. Underneath it, my hands were steady. I was as surprised by this as anything else that had happened in the past 48 hours. The van appeared at the far end of the street at 6:22. It was a Fiat Ducato in the pale blue livery of the Federal Transport System, moving at exactly the speed of an institution that has never had reason to hurry. I watched its headlights find the hazards and slow, watched the driver's window lower by 2 inches as the vehicle pulled to within 15 meters of the Giulia and stopped. I raised both hands in the apologetic, helpless gesture of a woman entirely at the mercy of her circumstances, and walked toward the driver's window with my shoulders curved inward and my expression composed into the particular blend of embarrassment and distress that I had spent 6 years perfecting for an entirely different audience. Mi dispiace, I began, my Italian broken and deliberate. The engine, it just stopped. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Behind the van, at the entrance to the street, a set of headlights appeared and went dark. Then another. Then a third. The driver was looking at me. Only at me. That was the entire point of me. The coat, the rain-soaked hair, the helpless hands. 6 years of being looked past had taught me something Simon Ford had never intended as a lesson. That invisibility, when directed correctly, was its own form of power. I kept talking. I kept his eyes on my face, and behind him, in the rain-slicked dark of a Roman street that didn't appear on any tourist map, Ricci's men moved into position. It took 11 seconds to neutralize the driver and his escort. I know because I counted again. The same reflex from the airport terminal. The mind's insistence on measuring what it cannot otherwise control. 11 seconds of controlled, precise movement from Ricci's men, and then the rear doors of the Fiat Ducato swung open and someone was calling my name in a low, urgent voice from the darkness inside the van, and I understood that the part of this plan that had belonged to other people was over. The part that belonged to me had just begun. I climbed into the van without hesitating, not because hesitation was a luxury the timeline could not absorb. The interior smelled of industrial disinfectant and damp metal. A single fluorescent strip ran the length of the ceiling, casting everything in the pale, affectless light of institutional spaces, the kind of light designed to eliminate shadow and dignity in equal measure. Richard Bradford sat on the bench along the left wall, wrists shackled to a security ring bolted at waist height, ankles in a secondary restraint connected by a short chain to a floor anchor. Someone had exchanged his zegna for a gray transit garment that fit him the way all institutional clothing fits, as though the body inside it is incidental. He looked at me the way he had looked at me across the terminal floor, not with surprise, with recognition of something he had calculated as possible but not promised. "The key," I said. "Left breast pocket of the escort," Ricci said from outside the van, his voice precise and close. "Magnetic release. You'll feel the ridge on the left side of the fob." I had the fob in my hand within seconds, retrieved from the unconscious escort's jacket. Corneliani, I noticed absurdly even now, and I was crouching in front of Richard's ankle restraints when the first shot hit the side of the van. Not a loud sound. Quieter than cinema prepares you for. A compressed, percussive crack, followed by the particular ring of metal absorbing impact. Then another. Then a third. Higher, which meant elevation, which meant someone was positioned on the garden wall above the street and had arrived ahead of schedule or outside the information Ricci's network had mapped. Simon, always operating one arrangement beyond where you thought to look. "Stay low," Richard said, his voice carrying the unnerving calm of a man whose nervous system had long ago recalibrated its threshold for threat. He shifted his weight to give me the best angle on the floor anchor, and I pressed the magnetic fob against the ridge Ricci had described and felt the mechanism release with a clean, engineered click that was the most beautiful sound I had encountered in 2 days. The ankle restraints fell. I moved to the wrist shackles. My hands were not shaking, which struck me as information about myself I hadn't previously had access to. The fob required a secondary contact point on the wrist unit, smaller, recessed, requiring more pressure than the ankle release. I applied it. Nothing. Applied it again, angling the face of the fob the way you angle a key that is almost right, but not quite. Another impact hit the rear door. Then a shout from Ricci, Italian, rapid, a command to someone positioned at the street entrance. "Angle it toward you," Richard said quietly, watching my hands. "The reader is offset, toward you and down." I did exactly that. The wrist shackles opened. Richard stood in one movement, the full height of him suddenly present in that pale fluorescent space, and took exactly 1 second to assess the interior of the van with the systematic efficiency of someone reading a room he has already memorized in theory. He picked up the escort's fallen radio, evaluated it, set it down. He looked at me. "You're unhurt," he said. Not a question, a confirmation, something he was logging. "Yes," I said. He nodded once, and then his hand, the same hand I had watched, moved toward his holster in a Roman airport terminal a lifetime ago. Was it my arm? Not gripping, guiding, with the careful authority of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is ensuring you arrive there also. We came out of the van low and fast, into the rain and the amber-smeared dark of the street. Ricci's gunmetal Maserati was already moving, the rear door held open by the young man who never spoke, whose face in the wet light was arranged in an expression of profound, focused relief. I got in. Richard followed. The door closed. The Maserati accelerated into the maze of Rome's oldest streets with the quiet, devastating confidence of a car that has never once doubted its own capability. And the street behind us, the garden wall, the shackles on the floor of the pale blue van. Simon's expensive, invisible arrangement receded into the dark and the rain. Richard sat beside me in the leather interior, wrists unmarked where the shackles had been, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, without looking at me, in a voice that carried the specific, measured weight of a man who does not spend words carelessly, he said simply, "Thank you, Brenda." It was the first time he had used my name. I looked straight ahead at the rain-glossed streets and felt something that had been locked in my chest for 6 years shift, almost imperceptibly, toward open. The cellar was older than anything I had ever stood inside. You could feel it in the quality of the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of accumulated time, layer upon layer of it, pressed into the tufa stone walls like a geological record of every secret Rome had ever needed to keep below ground. The entrance was through a wine cellar beneath a private residence in Trastevere, accessed via a door that looked structural until Ricci applied precise pressure to a specific stone in the lower left corner, and the mechanism released with the sigh of something very old, being asked to move one more time. The stairs beyond were narrow and worn smooth in the center, the edges still sharp, which told you that whatever traffic they had absorbed over the centuries had always been careful and always been purposeful. The space below was not uncomfortable. Someone had seen to that with the quiet thoroughness that characterized everything in Richard Bradford's operational world. A Persian carpet, Tabriz, deep burgundy, the kind that absorbs both sound and lamplight, covered most of the stone floor. A refectory table ran along one wall, its surface occupied by a baccarat decanter of something amber, 4 crystal glasses, and a closed laptop. Wall-mounted lanterns cast the room in warm, directional light. Against the far wall, a leather Chesterfield in cognac, aged to the particular softness that cannot be manufactured, only earned, faced a low table bearing a leather document case that had been unlatched, but not opened. Richard changed in an anteroom, and emerging in dark trousers and a charcoal merino sweater that Ricci had sourced from somewhere in the preceding hours, with the invisible efficiency that seemed to govern all logistical matters in this world. He looked, in the lantern light of a 2,000-year-old Roman cellar, like himself, whatever that meant, like a man restored to the precise register in which he operated most naturally. He poured 2 glasses without asking, set one in front of me, sat at the refectory table, and opened the laptop. "How long?" I asked. "Since the second day," he said. I sat down across from him and looked at the screen he turned to face me. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, then another moment to understand the scale of it. What Richard Bradford had built from inside a federal holding cell, through Ricci, through the young man who never spoke, through a network of attorneys and financial technicians whose communications had been routed through servers in 4 jurisdictions, was not a counterattack. It was a demolition. Patient, architectural, conducted with the precision of someone who had spent 19 years learning how power structures absorb frontal pressure and deflect it, and had therefore decided to work from the foundation upward. Simon Ford's financial empire rested on 3 primary instruments: a Luxembourg holding structure that managed his European assets, a network of Delaware-registered shell companies that processed his domestic income streams, and a Cayman-based investment vehicle, through which he moved the kind of capital that prefers not to be observed in transit. I knew about all 3, and I had signed documents adjacent to all 3. But I had never understood, until I sat in that cellar looking at Richard's screen, that each of these instruments had a specific structural vulnerability that Simon had been too confident, too certain of his own permanence, to adequately insulate. The Luxembourg structure had been quietly reported to the European Financial Monitoring Authority through a compliant intermediary. The Delaware companies were the subject of an anonymous filing with the relevant federal oversight body that had arrived, Richard told me, the morning after his arrest, prepared in advance, released on a schedule. The Cayman vehicle was the most elegant, a former associate of Simon's, a man carrying a financial exposure Simon had used as leverage for 11 years, and had been quietly offered something Simon had never thought to offer him: relief. Complete, documented, irrevocable relief, in exchange for a signed testimony that was currently residing in the inbox of a federal prosecutor in Washington, whose reputation for thoroughness was, Richard said, without qualification. He used people's fear as currency, Richard said, closing the laptop with one hand. Fear is only valuable if the person holding it is the only one who can offer relief. Remove that exclusivity. He picked up the crystal glass, and the currency collapses. I stared at the closed laptop. "You did all of this from a cell." "I had time," he said simply. "And Ricci." I thought about the photograph Simon had sent to my hotel room, the long lens, the message. "Now you have no one." The absolute, the luxurious certainty of a man who had never once imagined that the pieces he'd spent years arranging could be moved by someone other than himself. "He doesn't know," I said. "No," Richard said. "He doesn't." He set down the glass and looked at me across the refectory table with the particular quality of attention I was beginning to understand, was simply how he looked at things. Fully, without the protective distance most people maintained between themselves and whatever they were seeing. "He believed arresting me solved his problem," Richard said. He forgot that a man who has already lost the thing he was most afraid of losing, he paused, has very little left to be cautious about. Adriana. Florence. The 4th-floor apartment and the letters he had read too carefully. I understood then that this had never purely been about me, and I had been the moment, the airport, the raised hand, the 30 seconds in a crowded terminal. But the machinery had been in motion long before that. Simon Ford had made the mistake of drawing the attention of a man who was already looking for somewhere to direct a 19-year debt of grief. I had simply been the reason he stopped waiting. The news about Simon reached us the following morning. Ricci delivered it with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything, setting a tray on the refectory table bearing 2 espressos in porcelain demitasse cups, a folded copy of a financial newspaper whose front page carried nothing yet, but would soon carry everything, and a single printed document that he placed face down beside Richard's cup before withdrawing to the far end of the cellar, with the instinctive discretion of a man who understands the difference between being present and being intrusive. Richard turned the document over, read it, and set it back down. He left on a private charter at 2:17 this morning, he said. Filed a flight plan to Geneva. Changed it to Dubai, somewhere over the Alps. I wrapped both hands around the espresso cup, the particular comfort of something small and warm and real, and absorbed this information the way you absorb news you have been bracing for without admitting it. Not with relief exactly, with a careful provisional feeling of someone who has learned not to mistake a door opening for an arrival. Dubai won't hold him, I said. No, Richard agreed, but certain conversations will follow him there. And from Dubai, the available destinations narrow considerably. He picked up his cup. Simon Ford has spent 20 years building a world in which he can move freely. He has spent the last 72 hours discovering that the architecture of that world has been quietly revised. I thought about the Luxembourg filings, the Delaware testimony, the former associate in the Cayman Islands, who had finally been offered something more durable than fear. I thought about how Simon had stood in a Roman airport terminal, with his lawyers flanking him like expensive furniture, smiling the smile of a man who has never once been made to experience consequence, and how that smile had contained within it the absolute certainty that the world would continue to organize itself around his convenience. The world had other ideas. We left the cellar at midday through a different route than we had entered, up through the private residence, out through a walled garden where a November rose had somehow persisted on a stone trellis, its color so precisely red against the gray sky that it looked deliberate, like punctuation. A car was waiting on the street beyond the garden gate, not the Maserati this time. A sand-colored Range Rover with tinted glass, and a driver who acknowledged Richard with a single nod and said nothing else for the entirety of what followed. We drove north. The city dissolved gradually behind us, though surrendering its density in stages. The layered apartment buildings giving way to villas, the villas to countryside, the countryside to the particular quality of Tuscan light that painters had been attempting to capture for 6 centuries without quite succeeding, because it was not a quality of illumination, but of permission, as though the landscape itself had decided to be seen clearly. I did not ask where we were going. I had, I realized, stopped needing to ask questions whose answers were already demonstrating themselves. The villa appeared at the end of a cypress-lined drive that took 4 minutes to traverse at the unhurried pace the driver maintained, long enough to understand that what waited at the end of it was not a property, but a statement. Limestone facade the color of aged cream, shuttered windows, an loggia draped in the skeletal remains of summer wisteria that would, in 3 months, be extraordinary. An iron gate with a combination that the driver entered without being asked. A courtyard with a central well and a fig tree older than anyone present could reliably estimate. Inside, the room smelled of beeswax and wood smoke and thyme. The furniture was substantial without being heavy. A Borghese console in the entrance hall, silk curtains in the color of old wheat, a kitchen where copper pots hung from a ceiling beam like burnished punctuation marks. In the main sitting room, a fire had been laid, but not yet lit, and on the mantel above it sat a small framed photograph of a woman with Richard's eyes and a smile that had clearly been doing its best, in that moment, to be larger than whatever it was working against. No, I did not need to ask who she was. Richard crossed the room to the mantel and stood there for a moment with his back to me, the way people stand when they are having a private exchange with someone no longer present. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat, Caruso, beautifully structured, the kind of garment that holds its shape against anything, and produced a key. Old, substantial. Iron, worn smooth at the bow from years of use, attached to a leather fob stamped with the coordinates of the property in simple numerals. He set it on the console table beside me. "The caretaker comes Tuesdays and Fridays," he said. "The cellar has a 2009 Brunello that has been waiting for a reason to be opened. The wisteria will need attention in the spring." He paused. "You mentioned once, in the transport van, when you thought I wasn't listening, that you had never lived somewhere that felt like yours." I had said that, quietly to myself, in the compressed and desperate arithmetic of a woman calculating what survival might look like on the other side of everything. He had heard it. "This is yours," he said. Simply. Finally. With the unadorned directness of a man who has learned that the most valuable things are the ones you do not qualify. I looked at the key on the console, at the fire waiting to be lit, at the photograph on the mantel, the woman with his eyes, the smile doing its brave and insufficient work against whatever the camera had not been permitted to see. "And Simon?" I asked. "Simon Ford is a man who has lost his architecture," Richard said. "Without it, and he is considerably smaller than he believed himself to be." He looked at me with that quality of complete attention, the gaze that did not protect itself with distance. "He will not bother you again. This is not a promise I am making. It is a condition I have already arranged." Outside, the Tuscan countryside held its particular quality of light in both directions as far as the eye could reach. Unhurried, ancient, utterly indifferent to the small violences of small men who had briefly believed they owned some portion of it. I picked up the iron key. It was heavier than I expected, the weight of something real, something that opened an actual door in an actual world, where I was, for the first time in 6 years, accountable to nothing and no one but my own choosing. "The wolf," I said quietly, remembering what Ricci had called him in the dark chapel. "Does he always guard what he claims?" Richard Bradford looked at the photograph on the mantel one final moment. Then he moved to the fireplace, struck a long match from the box on the hearth, and touched it to the laid kindling with the patient certainty of a man who has never once started a fire he did not intend to keep burning. "Always," he said. The fire caught,